السلام عليكم. Good evening and welcome. أهلا وسهلا في هذه الجلسة التي تمزج بين العراق وبريطانيا وأيضا الإمارات العزيزة. أنا مينا العريبي، رئيسة تحرير صحيفة The National هنا في أبو ظبي. معي ضيف عزيز معالي ناظم الزهاوي، اليوم يحدثنا عن كتابه. طبعاً ناظم الزهاوي اسم معروف ببريطانيا واسم معروف أيضاً بالعراق، وعائلة الزهاوي من العائلات العريقة بالعراق، ولكن أيضاً هناك حقبة سياسية مثيرة للجدل راح نناقشها بعد شوية، وكلها يناقشها ناظم الزهاوي في هذا الكتاب، الفتى القادم من بغداد، The Boy from Baghdad. رحلتي من الوزيرية إلى ويستمنستر. الوزيرية اللي يعرف العراق ويعرف بغداد راح يعرف الوزيرية، وهذه من القضايا اللي أثارت انتباه من قرأ الكتاب، أنه التركيز على الحقبة الأولى في بغداد. طبعاً نناقش كل هذه القضايا، ولكن أول تعريف بسيط. ناظم زهاوي من الناحية المهنية هو أسس YouGov، وهي من أهم مؤسسات استطلاعات الرأي في بريطانيا، ما زالت اليوم، لكن هو خرج من YouGov كي يخوض في المجال السياسي. ومن ضمن المناصب اللي تبوأها ناظم زهاوي طبعاً كان في البرلمان البريطاني لسنوات كثيرة، لكن أيضاً كان رئيس حزب المحافظين Chairman of the Conservative Party، وأيضاً طبعاً وزير الخزانة، وزير العائلة، وزير حتى التعليم. دائماً هو مذكور في الإعلام أنه فتى أتى إلى بريطانيا لا يتحدث اللغة الإنجليزية أصبح وزيراً للتعليم في بريطانيا. هذه القضايا راح نتناولها، ولكن أولاً نحب نرحب بك ناظم في هذه الجلسة.
شكراً مينا. Thank you very much. إلي الشرف والفخر إنه أكون بأبو ظبي، والكتاب يترجم للعربي وينشر من أبو ظبي للعالم العربي.
صحيح، الكتاب تم إطلاقه في بريطانيا العام الماضي، نهاية العام الماضي، باللغة الإنجليزية، وكان له صدى كبير في بريطانيا، والآن إحنا نطلق النسخة العربية مثل ما تفضلت هنا في أبو ظبي. طيب، الجلسة راح تكون غالباً باللغة الإنجليزية، لأنه ناظم مثلي ما تعود إنه دائماً يحكي باللغة العربية إلا باللهجة العراقية، فأحياناً نخجل إنه نحكي باللغة بالفصحى، فرح نتحدث باللغة الإنجليزية، ولكن هناك مجال للأسئلة، وممكن طرح الأسئلة باللغة العربية، لأنه ما شاء الله ناظم يفهم اللغة العربية الطلاقة، ما عنده مشكلة. So I'm going to turn to English now, and I want to discuss the book first. So, how did the idea come about to write the book? Was it while you were in office or after you left office?
No, it was actually while I was in office. So I famously became the Minister for Vaccine Deployment for the United Kingdom. If you recall, during the pandemic, the UK had probably the longest lockdown of any country in the world. We had about 7 months of people being locked at home. And we had our challenges when it came to PPE, masks and gowns for hospitals, and of course testing for the virus, test and trace as it was called in the UK. And then I was the Minister for Trade and Industry in the Department for Business, working with Dame Kate Bingham on identifying teams that may come up with a vaccine. We weren't sure. We really had no idea whether we're going to be able to deliver a vaccine or not. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I get a phone call from the Prime Minister saying, "You're going to be my Beaverbrook." Beaverbrook, of course, was the armaments minister in the Second World War. "And you're going to vaccinate the nation. And I want to announce you in 48 hours. And I said, "Of course, Prime Minister, on one condition. I have to be able to speak with your authority." Anyway, I became the face of the vaccine program, and my brilliant team Many of them will remain anonymous because they're civil servants, but they did a brilliant job. We built an infrastructure where we were vaccinating 1 million, just shy of 1 million people a day. Anyway, on the back of that, I became the Secretary of State for Education, as you quite rightly pointed out. So I was promoted into cabinet. And I met a wonderful human being called Neil Blair. Now, Neil Blair is a literary agent. He has a very famous author in his stable, much more famous than Nathim Zahawi, J.K. Rowling of Harry Potter fame. And Neil said, your story is fascinating. You came to England at the age of 11, couldn't speak a word of English, and now you're Secretary of State for Education. Would you consider writing your memoirs? And I said, well, if you get me a contract, I'll think about it. And of course, I have to ask for permission from the cabinet secretary. He conducted a mini auction, and HarperCollins, one of the biggest publishers in the world, actually bid for the book, for the rights. So I had to go and explain to the cabinet secretary, Simon Case. I went to see the cabinet secretary, and he said, well, it's unusual because normally it's when you leave government that you write a book. You are in cabinet, but let me think about it. He came back and said, it's unusual but not unprecedented, so I'll let you do it on one condition. I said, yes, of course, CabSec, no politics. So I went back to HarperCollins and said, look, I could do my life story, that's fine. We'll still buy the book. So I began writing it as The Boy from Baghdad, my life story. Of course, when I left cabinet, I went back to HarperCollins and said, well, actually, if you give me another year, so 2 years in the making, I'll put all the politics in. I'll do the vaccine program, Brexit before that. I had the great honor of leading what is called Project London Bridge. When Her late Majesty passed away, I was Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, meaning I ran the cabinet office, effectively, the COO of government. And so I organized the funeral. So we've got the funeral chapter, of course, chairman of the party, education, and then leaving government as well. And a reflection on the 14 years. I was very lucky in the sense that in politics in the UK, my great friend John Healey, who's now Secretary of State for Defence, has spent the last 14 years in opposition. It's just the cycle sometimes can work against you. I was very lucky. I came into Parliament and my party won the election in the coalition initially, but we won. And so we were in government. And that's the story of the book.
So I want to stay a little longer with the book, but then we'll come back to the political side of it. But the book, it's really interesting because you started with your grandparents and you bring in the reader into a life in Iraq that many people outside of Iraq wouldn't even recognize. So why? Why did you start there? Did you start writing from that point? Did you go back in time? Tell us your thought process writing the book.
Yeah, it was interesting because I thought I had to explain my journey because I arrived in England in 1979 and genuinely, I was unable to speak, hardly a word of English, and I would hide in the back of the classroom because children can be incredibly cruel. And I didn't like to make mistakes, and I tried to string the words together that I knew in my head to make a sentence, to attempt to join in the subject matter. Of course, by the time I had made the sentence, the subject matter had moved on. So in early days, it was very painful. And then I thought I had to explain where I come from. And that's why I began with Iraq, my grandparents, Iraq before the Ba'ath Party, and then, of course, fleeing Iraq, as my father had to do, and this 11-year-old arriving in England, very cold, very grey, miserable first few months, because when you're 11, you formed some of the friendships, relationships. I've got a 12-year-old. It'd be very hard for her to understand why we would be moving, and it was the same thing for me. When I look back, it's the best decision my father ever made in his life. I have first cousins who ended up on the front line in the Iraq-Iran war. One of them disappeared for 12 years, and the Red Crescent didn't have any evidence for his survival, and then one day he just showed up back in Baghdad. So I have to pinch myself when I stand there, shaving my head in the morning in front of the mirror. How did I end up living in 11 Downing Street and being second Lord of the Treasury in the United Kingdom? It's a pretty remarkable story and a lot of luck.
So in the book, you talk about that time. You talk about having to flee Baghdad, and often when you were mentioned in the press, in the British press, it would say you fled Saddam Hussein. But of course, by then, 1979, Saddam Hussein had just become president. So this was before Saddam's time, so to speak. But then you couldn't go back during his tenure.
No, because my father was of Kurdish origin, and Iraq, as you know, and in many ways we can talk about some of the mistakes that the coalition made in the removal of Saddam Hussein. Everybody had to belong to the party. You couldn't get a job as a teacher in a primary school unless you signed up to the Ba'ath Party, and my father refused to be a party member, which marked him out anyway as someone who would be suspicious. And then being Kurdish was sort of doubly negative for him. And the moment, obviously, we arrived in England, because he had to flee, we were sort of, it took us 6 months behind. He left end of 78. And, I'd go to school and children would say, your father has an Interpol arrest warrant out for him. They're going to bring him back because he's a British spy. You remember in Iraq, if you're a commission agent, the punishment for that, the penalty was hanging, was the death penalty. And 11-year-old kids would be saying, your father's going to be hung. And it was pretty daunting. When we got to England then became, especially London, a sort of hub for the Iraqi opposition. And of course, then it's very difficult to go back once you're sort of, associating with Masoud Barzani and Jalal Talabani and others in England. Then it's impossible to go back to Iraq under Saddam.
In writing the book, was there anything you paused at and you said, I'm going to go very public with some of this? I mean, some of it was known, again, because you were, in the spotlight as a politician, but there were things that we didn't know that are in the book. Was there anything that made you pause and say, should I include this or not?
Lots of stuff. Some of the personal stuff, because when you're writing a memoir, you've got to really, it was quite cathartic in many ways, because I'd come out of government so painfully and publicly, and that's the final chapter of the book with my tax affairs. I had to really sort of reflect on my life, my career, where have I made mistakes, and if there's a theme in the book, and I reflect on the people who had the most impact on my life, whether it's my father, who is an incredible entrepreneur, salesman, but also made terrible errors of judgment, including losing everything. Jeffrey Archer, an incredible scout for talent. I remember when I was a young conservative in his penthouse, around the dining table, there were about 12 of us. I think 9 of us ended up in cabinet, ended up being members of parliament and in cabinet. And he discovered us before we'd even knew that we're going to end up being members of parliament. And then, of course, Boris Johnson. And people have very, very emotional opinions about my old boss, and those who think that he's probably the most consequential prime minister of his generation. If you go back to Thatcher, since Thatcher, it was really Major, and then Blair and Brown and Cameron and Theresa May. Boris is probably, the one prime minister who had to deal with sort of 3 major events. Obviously, Brexit, the pandemic as well, were pretty seismic shifts in the British economy and British politics. But all three characters, and that was a sort of theme in the book, were human, had flaws, had human flaws. Yeah. And sometimes in the United Kingdom, we expect our politicians to be flawless, and we attack them for the slight misdemeanor. And I guess the theme in the book was, now that I'd been behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz, right? And I've seen what it's like to be number 10 and number 11. And what I mean behind the curtain is you're normally paddling, and I feel for Keir Starmer tonight after the local elections yesterday, because you spend most of the time just dealing with crisis, both internationally and domestically. But now that I've been behind the curtain, there are no superhumans in politics. There are just human beings coming to work in the morning, trying to do a job, dealing with all sorts of challenges and making mistakes sometimes, but trying to do the right thing. And I think that's one of the things I tried to get across in the book. And of course, you have to open up to that, especially the final chapter in the book. Was pretty painful writing that final chapter, as in when I reflect, did I make a mistake? Should I have done things differently? It's hard.
Yeah. I read the final chapter and I was wondering, how measured you had to be in what you said, because at the end of the day, you have your family to think of, you have your legacy to think of, and it was your way of having your say about what happened and regarding how you left office. But it was also, I have to tell you, it still felt measured. Like I still wanted, and this is why I'm excited to have this opportunity, I wanted to know more about, do you have any regrets? Because the book, you're right, it takes a long view. Yeah. But do you have regrets? Do you wish it had gone differently, especially when it came to the matters that eventually led to your exit from cabinet?
I mean, look, I take the view, you've got to own your mistakes. And sometimes political memoirs end up being difficult to read because politicians find it hard to own up to their mistakes or say sorry. And it's somebody else's fault. And I just thought, actually, I should have been much more explicit in my ministerial declarations. We have the Nolan principle in the UK, which holds ministers quite rightly to a much higher standard than people who may be in important roles in commerce or in business, but not in government. And I think it was, in many ways, my fault. I should have been maybe more explicit about my declarations. I'd made a settlement with HMRC. I should have included within that I had to pay a penalty. It wasn't just a settlement. And that was my undoing. But it is painful because my family don't choose to be in the spotlight, in that, in the way that a politician does, and having 30 photographers outside your house for 3 weeks is hard because they don't choose a public life.
But you make that clear in the book. You really, it shows actually the effect of your parents, but also how important it is for you, your role as a parent, because throughout the book you say you're very aware of the impact this has on your family. It does, and
I think if I have a worry about our politics in the United Kingdom, it is that very few, in fact, none of my friends would consider going into public office today, because the level of scrutiny and the sort of, I guess, the monster that is social media and 24-hour news that has to be fed all the time. And the National does wonderful, serious journalism, but that doesn't apply to all of your colleagues in the media. Certainly not in the UK, where they feel they have to get their gotcha moment. They have to trip up a politician to be able to get the clickbait to get the headlines, rather than having sort of serious, deep debate or insight into a particular issue.
Yeah.
And that's worrying, because the pool of talent from which we pick the Prime Minister and the Cabinet is the parliamentary party. And I have to say, the quality of parliamentarian, I think, is moving in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
You either, dare I say, marry well, as some of my colleagues have done, or are self-made, or in some ways, probably underqualified to be a member of parliament, and it's such a sort of an uplift in wages, but you're missing the sort of the middle of the bell curve, real talent.
Sure.
That will look at politics and go, that's not for me. I'd rather go and work in commerce or trade or elsewhere rather than serve, because of the level of scrutiny.
Another theme in the book, and for those who came in a little later, this is الفتى القادم من بغداد, and Nathim will be signing them right after this conversation. Another theme in the book is identity, and the fact that you, as, again, former Conservative Party chairman, former, Chancellor of the Exchequer, somebody who oversaw the funeral of the late Queen Elizabeth II, chose to call himself the boy from Baghdad. And I have to say, at different points in politics in the UK, you can't really identify as being anything other than very British. And so, especially for the Conservative Party, there came a time when migration was actually such a lightning rod, and continues to be in the UK. And yet yours is a story of migration and of the success of migration. And one of the conversations globally that's happening now is that when you migrate somewhere, you have to become of that place, assimilate completely. And yet you don't. And your friends are from different parts of the world, but also many are Kurds, many are, Iraqis of different backgrounds, Arabs and otherwise. And so, one, how important was the theme of identity in the book? But a bigger question of, how do you square where the Conservative Party is compared to who you are and what you espouse?
Yeah, look, a couple of things on that. One, the Conservative Party that I joined in the 80s is a very different party to the party today. So when I first tried to get onto the approved list of candidates to stand for Parliament, that's how my party works. You have to go for a weekend assessment and to get on the list. I got a very polite letter back saying, basically, people like you should not be thinking about going into Parliament, but there may be other roles for you to play in politics. And dare I say, my party was probably on the wrong side of history on that. Changed rapidly with some amazing people who changed it. Baroness Trish Morris, an incredible lady, very close to the Middle East in many ways.
Yeah. She played an incredible role.
She played incredible. And in the book, I talk about Jeffrey Archer rang her because she was deputy chairman in charge of candidates to say this is outrageous. To turn down a talent like Nadhim Zahawi, as I'm referred to in England, is ridiculous. And she immediately asked me to go and see her. And I walked into her office. She looked at the letter, just ripped it up and threw it in the bin. She said, "Ignore that, young man. You're going to go for an interview tomorrow and then come back to see me." And I was on the list. Now, very different party today, where I'm proud that Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, Nadhim Zahawi became Chancellor of the Exchequer, Priti Patel, Kemi Badenoch now today. So the party's a very different party. Here's where I think the real threat, and it does worry me, because I think actually migration, if you think about the UK economy, right? Lloyd George, after the First World War, forgive me, there were 27 people working for every one retired person. 27. Today, it's less than 3 people working for every retired person. right? So we have a choice to make. Do we want to become Japan, right? Where if you go to Japan today, asset values, your home is worth about 80, 90% less than what it was worth in the 80s, right? Aging population, stagnant economy. Or do we want to embrace good migration and continue with a dynamic economy? The problem we have is twofold. One, when we were in the European Union, Germany and France chose a 7-year break before they allowed free movements from the Eastern European countries that came in, like Poland. Yeah. We didn't do the same thing. And our modeling said we'll probably get about tens of thousands of Poles. We ended up with 750,000, right? And what happened is, and you put yourself in the head of a 50-year-old white Brummie, right, from Birmingham, working in a warehouse, right, in the West Midlands, East Midlands, seeing his whole street change, right, speak a language that's foreign to him. They're white, but they were different. Work much harder. His gaffer in the warehouse says, these boys are working twice as hard as you are. I'm going to put you on notice to pull your socks out. You feel threatened. And the government keeps telling you that globalization is good, and this is a good thing. And then, of course, we had the movement from the Middle East. Post the Arab Spring, the migration into Europe. So today, in my view...
I mean, small numbers in the UK compared to what we had.
I don't disagree with you. Yeah. I'm really looking at European democracies, the wider picture. If you look at anywhere from Libya, south of Libya, there's about 500 million people, right? 500 million people who are going to come under pressure, whether economic, environmental, or political, right? Persecution, to move, right? Or to find an alternative. Now, clearly, Europe cannot absorb 500 million people. And we need to deal with the problem upstream. We need to be much smarter, which is why I applaud what the UAE is doing in Africa, for example, right? Which is a policy of win-win. Unlike what China sort of tried to do in Africa, the UAE is much more humble and serious about capacity building and prosperity in Africa. Because unless we create economies that can deliver hope for these people, they're going to have to move, right? And I think we need to think about the problem upstream. Otherwise, what's going to happen is democracy is going to start falling apart in the West because of the sheer impact this movement. You look at the illegal crossings into the UK, right? Of course, we have to have legal routes, and I've always argued in cabinet to say you can't deal with the illegal stuff if you don't have legal routes into coming to the UK.
And the UK and most of these democracies have minimal numbers coming in through UNHCR,
right,
where you do have people fleeing persecution, right, and very dangerous situations, right, in addition to those who want to have a better living, yeah, and opportunity at life.
Yeah, yeah.
We could talk for hours, but I have to be fair and open the floor to questions. So if you have a question, please just indicate to me and we'll get a mic to you. And you can ask about the book, or you can ask, well, Nadhim's been quite open. He said he's happy to take questions just generally. Any questions? No, we have a shy audience. Oh, there's a lady here. Great. I mean, I have many more questions, so it's not a problem.
Good evening. It was a very insightful session. My question is about the themes of diaspora and displacement in your book. I have not given it a read, and I'm definitely going to buy an English copy. I come from a family who was displaced from Iraq. I'm half Iraqi and half Kashmiri. So I actually know what identity crisis and displacement means. And as a journalist, I know how these themes influence your writing. So my question is that while writing your book, how prominent do you think that these themes were while you were writing? And how much you've revisited these memories that were painful, and how did you put it in the words?
It's a great question. Some of the painful stuff early on, I remember when I was enrolled in Holland Park School in West London, which was sort of one of the toughest comprehensives in London. In my first week there, I was chased in Holland Park by 3 much bigger boys, and I was the sort of the prey. And of course they caught me because they're so much bigger and faster than I am, and they decided to dunk me in the lake in Holland Park head first to see how long I can last underwater. I mean, that was horrific. I went to Sheen Comprehensive, where I was forced to fight a Bangladeshi kid. And I just, in the middle of this sort of human group of what looks like civilized young white boys and girls, were 2 brown boys baiting one another to fight. It's pretty humiliating. And of course, having to explain to people that I'm not a Paki, because I came from Iraq, and actually Iraq is Iraqi, and actually, I'm partly Kurdish, and it's different to Pakistan. When, if you remember, you've lived in England. It's a sort of one of those. I
can tell you many stories.
one of those things that was a sort of racist term that people used a lot. So they were painful things. But on the other hand, and I have to give you the sort of, and I've always been a glass half full kind of guy, is Stratford-on-Avon Conservative Association, right? Which skews, average age is about 55 if I'm being kind, probably older, chose Nadhim Zahawi as their champion, as their candidate, and then Stratford-on-Avon constituency, which is 96.8, maybe higher now, 97% white, affluent, middle class, farming community, elected Nadhim Zahawi over and over again with bigger majorities each time. That's a great thing about England. It's much tougher in other democracies. I think even in the US, you look at congressmen and women, they tend to do well in areas where their communities of origin would have congregated. So it's a balance between the two. But I really enjoyed actually putting some of this down on paper, and I thought it's only going to be interesting if I talk about the uncomfortable bits as well as the bits that the great achievements, because I sort of tried to research a lot of other political memoirs, and I just think the reader has to at some stage see the real person, warts and all, with their own insecurities and fears, but also of course achievements. But some of my colleagues only do the sort of the positive bits and forget all the other stuff that happened in their life.
Any other questions? Okay, gentleman at the front here.
Hello, my name is Mahmoud Naib, fellow Iraqi. We would like to welcome you to Abu Dhabi. It's an absolute pleasure. And also it makes it extra special to be interviewed by our favorite journalist, Mina. My question is really more on what we hear today in the news about that analogy of world politics today and the analogy to the 1930s and the challenges we have today with protectionism and rise of ultranationalism in the world. And being of the Conservative Party that really saw things back then with leaders like Winston Churchill warning people of what that could lead to. Well, my question is, first, do you agree with that analogy? And secondly, who do you see people within your party who are really raising these warnings today? Thank you.
And the noise in the
So
back.
can you repeat the analogy just
Yeah.
closer to your, just the analogy? Yeah.
Yeah, there are those who create these analogies between the 1930s
Oh, yeah.
and what's happening today in the world with the rise
Yes.
of ultranationalism
Yes.
and protectionism.
Yes.
And being of the Conservative Party, where we had giants like Winston Churchill back in the early 30s warning the world about what the consequences could be. First of all, my question would be, do you agree with that analogy? And who do you see leaders within your party who would be sort of raising the flag of warning? Thank you.
It was just the 1930s. We couldn't hear that
Yeah.
part. The rest of
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
yeah,
sure.
perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. Shukran.
I do worry about what is happening, and I can only speak for the United Kingdom in many ways. And I'm going to try and sort of articulate this for you in what I think could happen in the worst case scenario. I'm hoping this is not what will happen. It probably won't, because the British will protest by writing letters, whereas the French will burn tires and get close roads and districts down. But nevertheless, if you look at what is happening demographically, the white British are moving out of cities and into suburbs, right? Into villages. And actually, if you look at the evidence, the research evidence, the polling evidence, they have, those who don't interact with people of our color, of different backgrounds, have much greater fear about immigration than those who do interact, which is why you see the response in London or Manchester or Birmingham is very different in the city itself versus the donut on the outside. And we saw when Sadiq Khan introduced ULEZ, which is this ultra low emission zone, a group of what I can only describe as a sort of vigilante people taking the law into their own hands, forming and going out in the middle of the night with quite a bit of sort of silent, not so silent support from people, and vandalizing these cameras. Now you might ask me, well, what has that got to do with what's happening vis-a-vis immigration, the 1930s, the rise of fascism? It feels to me that we're getting close to this moment, because you saw it with the AfD in Germany. This morning, Reform is a different party to the AfD, to be fair to Nigel Farage. I don't want this to be taken out of context. But nevertheless, the rise of Reform, which is already sort of hurting the Conservative Party, but today have won a by-election in one of the safest Labour seats in the country, in Runcorn, right, is again a symptom of what I think is happening, which is this feeling in the country that the silent white majority are being unfairly treated in favor of minority issues, whether it be the illegal boat crossings or the NHS not being able to cope, public service not being able to cope. The extreme end of that is people take the law into their own hands. Back to the ULEZ vandalizing the cameras. You can very quickly move from vigilantes vandalizing cameras to vigilantes forming and attacking minorities. The fear of political Islam and populist smart communicators can obviously use those issues as trigger issues. That's my worry, is you're beginning to see this violent behavior much more than I've ever seen in the United Kingdom. And that's a dangerous place to be. Now, I do think that Europe stepping up in NATO is a good thing. it may be an uncomfortable position because a US president is basically saying, I'm not prepared to go on like this. You know, when I was in office first time around, I warned you, this time I'm serious, right? And having to actually begin to think about, you know, about what I was saying to you about what sort of economy do we want in the United Kingdom. My fear at the moment is we're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. We're not in Europe, yet we're outside, and the cost of government is just increasing. And therefore, the levers available to a Chancellor of the Exchequer is just to raise taxes. And people then feel more pain. And so there are lots of issues that I feel, you know, we could be in a very difficult place vis-a-vis our democratic institutions being attacked because people just don't feel they're working for them.
One more question here, and then we'll come to the gentleman there. Okay, so we've got 2 questions.
My name is Yahya Zaki al-Mallah. I'll take you back to the COVID time. I think whatever the political affiliation as a British, I think people felt proud about the vaccination program in the NHS. And obviously, you played a significant part of that. And also, as an Iraqi, you felt very proud that a person that belonged to Iraq and Baghdad is part of that program. I just want to ask you 2 reflections on that time. 2 really important parts that at significant moments is when Boris Johnson was ill. Your personal reflection on that moment. And the second one is obviously the parties and the break of rules in the government. Thank you.
Great question. One, thank you. And I guess, you know, Mina asked me this at the outset about the mistakes and the book. I'd do it all over again, right? If you ask me, I had a great career in business. I was very lucky. I built a great business for 10 years. I look at life in 10-year chunks. I did 10 years at YouGov. I've done more than 10 years, 14 years in politics. I think I've got another, hopefully, at least 2 chunks of 10 before they put me out to grass and retire me.
Well, given the retirement ratio in the UK.
Exactly right, exactly right. But the reason I say to you, I do it all over again, because people can't take away from you things where you really have made a difference. And I'm lucky enough to have been in government, in a position to be able to make a difference, use my skills as an engineer. I'm a chemical engineer by background, to build an infrastructure to vaccinate the nation from zero. We didn't have an infrastructure in the UK, and we built it, and the NHS did a brilliant job. The GPs locally would get together, the primary care networks they were called, and we'd have 5 or 6 GPs come together, decide who's going to lead. The rest would support, especially with some of the other patients, non-COVID patients. Same with hospitals, community centers, mosques, churches. Everybody came together. And actually, you know, back to the 1930s question, the one great thing in the DNA of the British people is in a moment of challenge, in a moment of crisis, we put our differences aside. I witnessed it twice, vaccine and the funeral, where it didn't matter what your political party was. I worked with Labour, the Lib Dems, the SNP. I briefed MPs every Friday, all 650 of them, right? Nothing ever leaked when I was vaccine minister. So I'm going to give you information which will be in the public domain in the next 24, 48 hours, but I'm telling you now because I need your help. You are my conduit to your people, to your constituents. And no one can take that away from you as an individual who wants, feels like they want to be a footnote in history, which is, I think, a great privilege. My home in London, the ground floor became vaccine HQ effectively, right? My dining room, and I've got these grey curtains, became famous, and people would sort of tweet at me on social media, about the grey curtains behind me, because I was on television every night, reassuring the nation that we're going to do this, and we're going to get through, and we're going to vaccinate them and save the country. I wasn't invited to a single party. You know, I was one of the few people who had the ability to move around, to be able to go, because I had to go from my home to number 10, to the NHS, to the Department of Health, and visit any center, vaccine center. And I'll never forget, I have to tell you, walking down Piccadilly on my own, not a soul, not even a police car, everything shuttered. And when I was young, there was a TV program called The Day of the Triffids. For those who lived in England will remember, where humans were basically extinct because of these aliens who destroyed us as a species. And walking down Piccadilly, I actually walked in the middle of the street, and I thought, is this the end? You know, will an alien life form come and say this is how they lived? And of course, a pandemic got rid of them, because we had no idea, you know, how lethal this virus is at the beginning. We were planning for morgues in Hyde Park, right? Because we wouldn't be able to bury the bodies fast enough. So it was a pretty serious moment. I have to say to you that I think, of course, the buck has to stop with Boris and what happened in Downing Street, and it was a terrible error of judgment because many families lost loved ones, couldn't go to a funeral.
The Queen sat alone.
Her Majesty sat alone, absolutely right.
During the
Absolutely
funeral
right.
of her beloved husband,
Absolutely
Prince
right.
Philip. I think
But
that was shocking.
I'm going to say something which isn't universally popular. And I've worked for many, I started work for Cameron as the apprenticeship czar, for Theresa May as the families minister, and then of course for Boris. When he focuses, he is a fantastic decision maker. And I say this as an engineer and someone who's built businesses. And he did focus on the vaccine program because he understood that this was existential to his premiership. And he was phenomenal. He'd call every night at 11 o'clock, and I'd take him through what we're going to do the next day, because we present to him almost daily, and ask him to support me on the things I needed support on. And he stepped up every single time. The rest of the stuff I was, you know, obviously less involved with. And clearly, some of his private life was chaotic, which didn't help. But he was a phenomenal boss, and I was worried about his health. You know, he was genuinely, you know, anyone who's lived in England will know, you know, our doctors are pretty, you know, sturdy and rugged characters. They don't put you in intensive care unless they really think you're close to death, and he really was.
There's a gentleman there with a question.
Congratulations on the book being published, and thank you for being here. I wanted to
The mic closer to your mouth, please. Just bring it closer.
I wanted to ask what are your relationships to your Iraqi background, and whether it changed during your stint in politics?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, great question. I mean, I have to say that the credit for what we are discussing today falls to Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed and the incredible leadership that I am privileged to call true friends. And you know your friends, by the way, and we were discussing this earlier, Mina and I, not when you are in high office. You know your friends when you exit high office. Your true friends are. And I have to tell you that the friendship and love and, you know, genuine support I have received from His Highness has been humbling and truly wonderful. And I think that's what makes this country, your country, an exceptional nation. Why do I say that? Because I think the leadership and if he were here, I think I could speak for him. He would say, everything you see is thanks to our father, Sheikh Zayed, right? Talk to me in 20 or 30 years' time, and then you can praise me, Natham. And that speaks volumes, in my view, for leadership. And I've seen good and bad leadership in the different roles I've held in politics and government. I wish Iraq had, the opportunity of this sort of quality leadership, and I lament that. It's been, 22 years since Saddam was removed. It's heartbreaking how challenged that country is, the people of that country are. I hope things will continue on a path of improvement. It's great that they're having elections. It's great because people are now getting used to understanding what delivery of services are and what does it mean to deliver services and to demand delivery from their politicians. So I think in many ways I'm spending a lot of time in your wonderful country. Why? Because I genuinely think this is the most sustainable economy, not just in the region, probably in the world. I said this to Larry Fink, who I became friends with when I was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he completely agreed with me. The thing that has happened in your country, which I think is exceptional, which only happens once every century, right? Venice under the Medici family, Hong Kong under the British Mandate, Singapore, is you create an environment where people want to come together. Over 200 nationalities living peacefully side by side in a pretty, rough and tumble region of the world, but doing great things together is a huge opportunity for the Middle East as a model of coexistence and prosperity. And that's a great thing.
Right, we're going to be running out of time very shortly, so I have two questions for you that you're going to have to answer quickly, I'm afraid. The first question is, again, throughout the book, the theme of identity, but also when you were in the public eye, there were times when we're like, for Iraqis, they said, is he Iraqi? Is he Kurdish? How does he identify? Is he British first? If you were to describe yourself to somebody today, how would you describe them in terms of identity and what you hold close to your heart?
Since I've just given a soliloquy about the Emirates, I feel I'm at home in Bil Imarat. But genuinely.
That's the politician. He knows a perfect answer. But we all feel home
where
here.
you feel you can put down roots, where you feel you are respected, where you feel equal, is the place where you feel at home, right? I was the adopted son of Stratford-on-Avon, because if you know anything about Stratford-on-Avon, you literally have to live there for at least a century before you're considered to be a Stratfordian. And so I was very careful in always calling myself as the adopted son of Stratford-on-Avon. And I just think, I look at my twin boys and their opportunity and the work they're doing here at Mubadala and G42. I look at what this country has done and what it is about to achieve. In my view, the next 10, 20 years, this is the UAE century. It's the thing I was talking about earlier. In soccer, and this is going to be painful.
Soccer, not football.
I follow England, and I was in Germany, I was in Qatar, I was in Japan with England, and of course my club is, put your hands over your ears, Manchester United, not Manchester City, but we are in a difficult place at the moment. Look, my view is, ultimately, I see myself as British rather than English. It was interesting that Rishi was asked the same question, and he saw himself very much as English. I think when you're not, I wasn't born in England. I was born in Baghdad, as the book quite rightly refers to it. But Britain took me in, took my family in, gave us succor and safety, and allowed me to live in number 11 Downing Street. That's a great country, as far as I'm concerned. But there is a beauty to the generosity of heart of the UAE that I think is compelling.
Absolutely. My final question to you is, if you could go back in time and speak to the 11-year-old boy, الفتى القادم من بغداد, what would you say to him?
I would say, well done. You've been very lucky. Try and pass on some of that good fortune to young men and women who are less fortunate than yourself. I will never turn away a young person who will email me or text me for any help, as long as I can do it, something about it. I've been unbelievably lucky in life, and you can work hard. And by the way, any CEO or politician who tells you that they designed everything in their life and it all worked out, they're either lying to you or they're naive, right? Because you can work as hard as you like, but sometimes you need Lady Luck to smile on you. And I was on the back benches because I didn't get close to the sort of the leadership under George and Dave, like some of my intake did. And I would wonder, what have I done wrong? I just go in every day, do quite well in Parliament, do quite well on the committees. I held there's a big program in the UK which is called Mr. Bates versus the Post Office. I was the first to recognize the error of the leadership at the Post Office. Never got promoted, right? Until Theresa May, to her credit, I hope she recognized my talent, and then of course Boris. And sometimes you just need luck, because you can work as hard as you like. But unfortunately, things just go wrong. But that's what I would say. I'd say, you've been very lucky. Try and pass some of that on.
That's great. Well, a great note to end on. Thank you so much for being so candid and for taking all my questions. He was great in our preparation. Nathim didn't want to know the questions in advance. I'm like, do you want to talk through? He goes, you can ask me whatever you want. So it was great, but it was a wonderful conversation. Thank you for your attendance and for your questions. There is book signing outside, so I urge you to pick up a copy. The translation's amazing. I've read half of it in Arabic and half of it in English, and both are really good. So I would recommend getting one of these. And again, Nathim, thank you so much for your time, and best of luck with the book and your future chapters.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.